Greetings fellow guitar travellers, it's Rowan J Parker once again with a further episode of soloing on static dominant chords. This will be part 3, and today in part 3 we're going to take a look at a slightly outside scale choice, which is the Lydian dominant scale, which is derived from melodic minor, and it produces some interesting colorized sounds. So we're going to get straight into explaining the theory behind it and show you exactly how it works in a musical context, and we'll give you some playing demonstrations as well. So hopefully by the end of the video you'll have a good grasp on exactly how this scale functions, and you can add it to your palette of colours when you solo. So let's get into it. Soloing on static dominant chords, looking at the Lydian dominant scale. Okay, so let's get down to the theory and explain to you why the things that work. So we've learned already that A7 is the 5th chord of D major, and all the approaches we've used up to now have relied upon that piece of knowledge. So for instance, A7 is the 5th chord of D major, which means we can play the 5th mode of the major scale against that chord, which would be A Mixolydian. And that's one approach. And then the other approach we've looked at so far is using pentatonic scales, and we found out that we can use E minor, F sharp minor and B minor pentatonic scales against our A7 chord, because these are the 2nd, 3rd and 6th chords of the key of D. So again, our information has been derived from the chord scale, the harmony of D major. The only exception to this so far has been the A minor pentatonic or A blues scale sound that we used against the A7, which, although not theoretically correct, is so common that our ear accepts it and doesn't hear it sounding unusual. However, the next scale choice will start to challenge your ears a little bit, because it's based on a completely different scale. It's not derived from the major scale at all, it's derived from the melodic minor scale. So we're going to go ahead and explain to you exactly how melodic minor scale harmony works. So just to set the scene here, we're going to go into the interval construction of melodic minor and compare it against the major scale and see how it differs. Now, if you know your major scale, you'll know it's this sound. Which in terms of intervals is root, major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, and major seven, and then of course the octave. Or we could put this into jazz terminology, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. Okay? So now let's look at the melodic minor scale on the same note and see how that differs. This is how it sounds. Okay, so it has quite a different sound, although we're only altering one note. And all we're doing is we're flattening the third degree of the scale from a major third to a minor third, because it is, after all, a minor scale. That being the case, the construction of melodic minor is root, major second, minor third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, major seven, and then the octave. And in jazz parlance, 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. I initially learnt the melodic minor scale, about 15 years ago. And at the time, I wasn't really much of a jazz player, and I had a really hard time hearing this scale as sounding minor, because to my ears at the time it just sounded like a major scale that had gone wrong, like I'd accidentally played a wrong note in a major scale, and I just could not perceive it as being minor. And if this scale is new to you, you will probably have the same reaction to it that I did. It just sounds odd and unusual, and therefore a lot of players tend to dismiss it as being too weird. But the reality is, once you get used to the sound and you understand how it works musically, it actually produces some of the most interesting and beautiful sounds in music, especially for playing over dominant chords, which is what this is all about. So we're going to do another little bit of theory now, which explains to you how I actually look at the scale in my mind, because it's not quite like this parallel comparison that I've shown you so far. Okay, so I hate to bore you with more theory, but I think this is important for you to understand exactly how the scale works. So let's look at my way of thinking about these scales now. Okay, so now let's look at the particular way that I think about these scales. And I really encourage you to try this method, because it simplifies a lot of the thinking. So instead of having many complex, diverse scales in your mind and trying to remember what each one is, you really only have one. So let me try and explain exactly how I look at it. This concept is by no means unique to me. Other players have used it extensively, and it's sometimes called parental thinking, or it's called minor conversion, and that is used by the great jazz player Pat Martino. It's also called the Lydian chromatic concept of tonal organisation, which is a very grand title indeed, and puts a lot of people off when they hear about it. But what it boils down to is this: instead of thinking about lots and lots of different things, you think about one thing, because it's much easier to think about one thing. So what really happens is that any chord that you play over, you convert or reduce in your mind to being one scale. And using this system, you can play over a huge number of different chords without the burden of having to think about all the different extensions and, you know, what is this and what is that. It just makes the thought process simpler. So let me have a bash at outlining to you exactly how I would approach this. We have our A7 chord. We've already learnt that A7 is related to the key of D major. Now, in jazz, it's the Dorian mode which is played the most commonly. It's the most habitually played mode, because minor seventh chords are some of the most common chords you play over. So D major, the Dorian mode of D major is E Dorian. Okay, so sounds like this one. playing over A7, I actually think about E Dorian. I don't think about D major or A mixolydian. For the purposes of orienting myself on the instrument, I think of E Dorian. So I make this conversion in my mind: A7 equals E Dorian. The reason this works is because everything's still in the key of D, right? So A7 is the fifth chord of D, and E minor 7, or E minor, is the second chord of the key of D. So they're related together. But it just makes the mental process for me easier. Now, of course, I am quite aware that when I'm playing over the A7 chord, where the root is, where the third is, the fifth, the flat 7, and so on. But in terms of shapes and just the ability for me to get round the instrument, that's what I would tend to do. I would tend to view this dominant 7th chord, A7. In my mind, I'm thinking, right, this is E Dorian. Okay, now this is quite useful when it comes to looking at our melodic minor scales. Melodic minor also produces dominant chords, and a melodic minor scale produces dominant chords on the 4th and 5th degrees. So E melodic minor would produce a dominant chord on A7 and also on B7. So it is the melodic minor scale on its 4th degree that we're going to use to play over this dominant chord. A7, right? So if we now intervallantly compare the E Dorian scale to the E melodic minor scale, we'll see in fact that they are very, very similar, and in fact they only differ by one note. So let's show you that. Here's E Dorian. Which is 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7 and 1. And now E melodic minor, which we've already had a brief look at. Okay, which is 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. So we can see that the only note which is different is the quality of the 7th. In Dorian we have this note, D, which is the flattened 7th or minor 7th, and in melodic minor we have D sharp, which is the major 7th or regular 7th, natural 7th. So because of this fact, the two scales are almost identical, and in my mind they become really the same thing. I know that if I'm playing over a dominant chord, let's say it's A7, dominant chord we're talking about, then for me the easiest way to think about it is to think, right, I'm going to convert this to the 2nd degree, and I know on the 2nd degree I can play E Dorian or I can play E melodic minor. So really in my mind all I'm thinking about is E minor. I'm thinking E minor. The advantages of this approach is I'm not trying to keep in my mind, A mixolydian is a major scale with a flattened 7th. I'm not trying to think about, A Lydian dominant is a Lydian mode which has a sharpened 4th, but then it also has a flattened 7th. I find that way of thinking to be quite, awkward, and I think if I was to try and think like that, then I just wouldn't be able to play over the changes correctly. So this conversion system works amazingly well for trying to get access to these much more advanced scale sounds by making your mental processes a lot simpler. So that's really how, for me, the conversion system works in my mind. So let's compare the two scales now. If we play E Dorian over A7, the effective scale sound we generate is A mixolydian. If we play E melodic minor over A7, the effective scale sound we generate is A Lydian dominant. So, without sounding like I'm going over it and over it and over it, it just makes the whole thing a lot simpler to think about, and that is how I would approach thinking about soloing on these dominant chords. So I hope that theory has been clear enough. If you feel that it's gone right over your head, I suggest you wind the tape back and look at it a few more times until it really starts to sink in. But if you do grasp it and you start to apply it in your actual playing, you will find that it opens up a whole range of possibilities, and you don't have to think about anything that complicated. Alright, so that does it for the theory. Let's move along to some playing demonstrations now using the Lydian dominant scale, and I hope you can appreciate just how interesting this colour is. Alright, let's do it. Well, I hope you can see from that demonstration that it's a very interesting scale to use, and it's got a lot of interesting and outside colour. You might not want to use a scale all the time, because initially you might find it just sounds a little bit too odd for your ear, because it will need to adjust to the new sound. But once you do adjust to it, you will find yourself wanting to use it more and more. And when you get really used to it, you will actually find it's a much preferable sound to sounds like Mixolydian, which as I referred to in one of the other videos in part 1, it can get very kind of boring to listen to after a while, because it's just too nice. And I think there's nothing wrong with a bit of dissonance, and to be honest, jazz is all about the introduction and control of dissonance. So it's a great scale to use. Before we wrap up, I'm just going to look at the interval construction of the scale in relationship to the chord, because that's something I didn't do earlier on. And I just want you to appreciate exactly what intervals you're playing against the chord when you're playing this melodic minor scale. So let's have a quick look. The first note is E, which in relationship to the A7th chord is the 5th of that chord, a very passive note. The next note, F sharp. In relationship to the A7 chord, it's the 6th or 13th, so it's a really nice colour tone. The next note is G, which in relationship to our chord is the flattened 7th. Okay, flat 7, defining its dominant characteristic. The next note is A, which I'm sure you realise is the root. And then we have B, which is the second or ninth degree. It's another nice colour tone. And then we've got C sharp, which, as I'm sure you're aware, is the major third of the chord. And now for the interesting note, we've got D sharp. In its relationship to the A7 chord, this is either the sharpened fourth, it could be described as, or often it's also referred to as the flattened fifth or diminished fifth. So it introduces a flat 5 on a dominant chord. So the harmonic effect of playing the E melodic minor scale on top of the A7 is to produce the colour of A7 flat 5, which is quite a, these days anyway, quite an acceptable colour to put on a dominant chord. And that's really why it works. So that really wraps it up for the Lydian dominant scale. I'll be covering melodic minor in much more depth on subsequent video lessons because it's a really important subject in jazz and very, very much misunderstood. Most players just don't know how to use it right, which is a pity because, as I said earlier, there are some exceptionally beautiful sounds inside the scale. So, thanks very much for watching. I would encourage you to head over to my website, which is www.rowanjparker.com, and you can find a whole ton of guitar related stuff, everything from in-depth jazz lessons to stuff for simple beginners and also mind-boggling widdly shred if you like that as well. So it's a great resource. You can also get me on Facebook. I have a Facebook page which you can like if you like it. I'm on Twitter at RowanJParker. I'm also on SoundCloud at Rowan-Parker, and there's a ton of backing tracks up there which you can download. Most of them are downloadable and you can practice your improvisation on. Well, thank you very much for your attention and watching, and we hope you've learned something about this particular sound. Rather theoretical, I know, but once it's grasped, it's a fantastic sound which will broaden your playing tremendously. So have at it. Rowan J. Parker signing off.